Welcome back, humans of the world, to another episode of Around the Outside, the American Formula One podcast. And today we have a very special episode because we are interviewing a very special guest, a local sports writer for the state of New Hampshire. He has been involved in motorsport for a numerous amount of years. He comes to us with a closed wheel experience of motorsport, and I thought it would be very interesting to have a conversation about the difference between open and closed wheel, and maybe we'll be able to find some middle ground during this episode. Please allow me to introduce Terrill Covey. What's up, brother?
Not too much. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for coming on. This is got to be kind of an out-of-body experience for you because aren't you on the other side of this most of the time?
I am. Yeah, it's weird to have people asking me questions. I feel like I'm losing control.
Well, this is also the second one we've ever done. So just if you could give a virtual nod of, no, that's not an interview thing you want to do, feel free. It's a learning session for the both of us right now. So how long, to give our listeners some backstory, how long have you been writing about motorsport?
So I started in, this was 2014. So looking at this will be about the 9th year. I had my undergrad degree at University of New Hampshire was actually journalism. And I went to work full time for the Portsmouth Herald and actually an offshoot of the Herald called the Hampton Union, which I don't even think exists anymore, and realized I hated politics and deadlines. So maybe that wasn't the best career choice for me. And so I left and I went into education. And after that, the sports editor reached out to me and said, "Hey, would you ever be interested in doing any sports writing?" And I was like, "Oh man, if I'd been doing sports writing, I probably would have never left. So yeah, I'll help out with that." So been doing some sports writing since about 2002. And then I was able to get into the local kind of racetracks and here in New Hampshire and start doing a column in 2014. And that's kind of what kicked it off.
Was motorsport your first love, though? When you started writing, did you say, okay, I'm going to go watch a baseball game, but I'm really thinking about that race I want to cover?
You know what? That's a great question because as a kid growing up, I loved motorsports. So I grew up at a small track in Vermont. It was football and racing were my two passions. And, but I'm useless around a car. And I had kind of gotten away from it a little bit. I kind of, I moved down here. There's a bunch of tracks down here. I had never really attended them. And what kind of the impetus for that racing column was the NHRA, which is kind of the NASCAR of drag racing, was coming to Epping, which is right in our backyard. And I said, it'd be cool for us. We should probably cover this. It's a pretty big deal. And then they said, "Hey, what about NASCAR? Would you want to cover NASCAR too?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, I'll cover NASCAR when it comes to New Hampshire." So kind of started from there. And then I said, there's 3 tracks right in our coverage area. Why don't I start going to those and telling some of those stories, And so I had drifted apart a little bit from racing. Yeah, we lost touch through the years. I still went up to the track in Vermont fairly frequently because I still, that's just my home. But I hadn't really gotten into the tracks down here. And then once I started writing that column, I would just kind of lit the fire again and it, has grown from there.
For our international base, when we say NHRA, those are drag racers. And to put into perspective of a drag racer for us compared to anything, how quickly do these things accelerate? Like, what's it like being at one of those events?
People think I'm exaggerating when I say this, but I tell people it's literally life-changing. It's not like any other motorsport on a lot of levels. So this story, the first time I went, I didn't really know what to expect. I'd watched them on TV. I'd been to drag races in Epping before with, regular everyday Joes and their grocery getters, and some nicer race cars. But I was walking along, wanted to kind of get up as close as I could along the fence, walking along when the first couple of cars went up to the line. And I happened to have the hiccups. And both of the cars happened to punch the throttle at the same time to do their burnouts. And the compression stopped a hiccup mid-chest. It hurt wicked bad. Just stopped it. And I was just like, ugh! Oh my God. And I was like that, and it scared the bejesus out of me. Like I jumped out of my skin, my hiccup stopped dead center, and I was like, okay, this is a whole different thing than anything I'm used to. And so kind of that first weekend, and I keep saying 2014, it was 2013. I'm a liar.
We're
And
not counting over here.
yeah. And so it was just it kind of it literally rocked my world, and kind of figuratively. So that's at the professional level, the NHRA stuff. It's just I really enjoy it. I've continued to do some coverage for them on a website of a friend of mine that covers motorsports, and done a little bit of NHRA coverage for him and for the newspaper, and when they're here in town. So it's pretty fun.
No, yeah, NHRA reminds me of the fighter pilots on the aircraft carriers. Just
Yeah.
that same sort of acceleration and ferocity and the explosion of power that you get to witness coming out of one of those. It really is like a fight on physics,
Yeah.
and you're happy that there's a rear wing because you're fighting gravity in sort of a way too, because you need all that downforce to push the ass end in so you
Yeah.
won't fly away. And have you seen, because this is a Formula One podcast, have you ever seen or been to a Formula One race?
I have not been to one. I started kind of when a lot of I will say I'm a fair weather fan is probably even too common, but when the popularity started to take off a couple of years ago, around post COVID, kind of, it seems like a lot of people started to kind of jump on board. And I am also a sports card collector. So that was actually my first point of contact. They started doing these
Hmm.
Formula One sports cards. And I was like, what is going on? Why are all these people, and why are these selling for absurd amounts of money? And I said, all right, how is this all of a sudden a thing? And I said, you know what? I love racing. I got to check this out. But I'm lazy on the weekends, and a lot of those races are early morning. So I kind of
Yeah.
slowly I'd catch the end of one here and there. And I'm like, all right, kind of trying to figure it out. But then I have a colleague at work, and then having the chance to have met you, and I'm like, all right, I gotta be a little more serious about this and really dig in. And I did miss the race last weekend, which I know multiple people have since told me was an error on my part. But
It was bananas. It was a crazy race, and it also was in 1 a.m. though.
yeah.
Why would you?
Well,
I love this
so the
sport,
day
and
before I had stayed up and I watched the practice, some of the practice, and I
okay.
fell asleep at the very beginning of qualifying. So I fell asleep as they were started qualifying. I was like, and but then that I had crashed out the next night, missed everything.
Could you pick up on the difference in attitude from the people of Formula One versus NASCAR just in that brief practice session that you watched?
Oh, I mean, in the couple of races I've watched, it's very every minute is a business. It seems like, and
Yes.
rather than kind
Yep.
of a job, and there's elements of that to NASCAR. I think there's and even NHRA, which again is a whole different animal. You see kind of the business side of things with sponsorships and all that, but that everything is business like. The whole demeanor is business like. It seems like with the F1 folks, and it's really interesting to kind of see that even in their speech and diction. And some of that might be because a lot of them are not from the United States, the
Yeah.
majority of them, but
Yeah. Yeah.
even that is just like, it's notably different in the way they speak to each other and speak over the radio. And I heard, I don't remember who it was now, but one of the drivers get a little fired up on the radio, and I was like, ooh, yeah, I don't feel like I've heard that much with these guys.
Hmm. That's what I find, first of all, is the communication that's different between NASCAR and Formula One. There is, I don't know if from the American perspective, if the accents that we hear just gives it that, I don't want to say the word superiority, but that step up for motorsport racing. It's definitely a different world, and the feedback from driver to engineer, how did you find that was listening? Because the NASCAR feedback, I believe to be completely different. And I don't know if I'm asking this for my own validation, but the machinery isn't equal at
Yeah,
all. So you can't really talk about the same thing. So for those of us who aren't familiar with NASCAR, how do those guys describe an issue to their engineers?
a lot of and most of their communication is through to like crew chiefs and spotters. So I think it's even a little different in that aspect. But I think that while a lot of them maybe know the technical side of things, you'll hear something, she's pushing like a bitch, which if you ever
Yeah.
heard that something, and if you ever heard that in an F1, everybody would fall out of their seats, I think. So that it again, it kind of goes back to what you were talking about, of just the way that they speak and interact is a little bit different. And they, I mean, at every race, there's a little bit of kind of you'll hear a driver or two getting a little feisty with their crew chief or their spotter or whoever in that communication. And I mean, they have a whole segment of their weekly race show on Fox that's just listening to stuff on the on the radios. I forget, like radioactive, I think they call it. And it's a lot of it is like either funny stuff the guys say or those kind of heated exchanges among teams where you're like, oh, okay, they weren't having a very good day.
Now, there's definitely seems to be more closed lips in Formula One, and it's funny. You don't have that down home feel of racing, just pure racing. Because we have, for those of us who are not into NASCAR, you have to remember that moonshiners, bootleggers during the Prohibition era, that's what this sport was founded on. That's what NASCAR is founded on. And for Formula One, it was post-war rich aristocrats wanting to burn some fuel and some rubber and some money. So the way that the foundations are in each of these sports has stayed, I would say, throughout all the 100+ years it's been going. So another difference, I think, that we can talk about, the fan base. both sports draw an incredible number of fans to a race weekend. Did you get a chance to look at the infield, though, of a Formula One race?
I haven't. However, I have seen. I follow a lot of race photographers who cover a lot of different types of racing, and the vibe that I get from photographs is that it's a pretty different scene. It seems to almost be a social status indicator with F1. And even and to a lesser extent, you see a little bit of that, I think, with Indy over here too, but certainly not on the level of F1. Indy is almost kind of the meeting ground between the two groups.
Oh yeah, that is, yeah, it is.
But and then it's funny because NASCAR has worked very hard to try to draw in more diverse audiences and done a lot of things. And you got guys like Pitbull, the rapper, is a car owner now, and Michael Jordan is a car owner. And you got these kind of cross pollination of sports. Brad Daugherty, a former NBA player, has been a team owner for a long time. So they're doing these different things to just try to draw in different audiences. And based on that, some of it I think is working. They're having some success on that level. But as you mentioned, the roots of NASCAR are the roots of NASCAR, and they're I mean, my biggest passion in racing is the short tracks, the local guys going out that have a garage and throw a car together for the weekend, and that you see those roots. It's fun. I've got to know a lot of those folks. It's kind of just fun to see that some of them that make that progression. A young kid from Hudson, New Hampshire, who he started racing little 4-cylinder cars in a youth division over in Hudson, New Hampshire, made I think 6 or 7 starts at the Xfinity Series last year. That's kind of worked his way up. And young kid CJ McLaughlin, who's also a New Hampshire kid, I forget what town he's from. He ran I think full time in Xfinity the last couple of years. And I listened to him on another podcast. He was racing little Legends cars, which are those little tiny things that go about 100 miles an hour and look like tin cans with wheels. They crank.
Yeah.
And he decided he wanted to go NASCAR races, so he just started beating feet the old fashioned way, going out, talking, trying to recruit sponsors. And found an opportunity, which is, you don't see the stories like that all that often anymore. So being able to kind of watch these guys go from these little short quarter-mile tracks, and all of a sudden you're watching them on Saturdays and hopefully eventually on Sundays, is kind of cool.
That's really cool. And we have the short tracks to thank for Andretti. That's how he got his start back in the 60s, by like, taking the car that was in the shop on a Tuesday, fitting it up for the race on the Saturday, and then fixing it on a Sunday. And I brought up the differences because they are noticeable between, closed wheel and open wheel. But what is it for you that brings you into motorsport? Because the same ingredients, it doesn't matter if it's open or closed, are all there. What is it for you that you think draws that much attention to these sports?
I mean, I can more speak from my own experience. So when I was a
Please,
little
please.
kid, I was, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years old. My dad raced stock cars at Thunder Road up in Barrie, Vermont, little quarter-mile racetrack that, and I know you're not a big NASCAR guy, but got Ken Squire was part owner of that. He's in the
Mm-hmm.
NASCAR Hall of Fame. Dave Moody, who does a lot of broadcasting now, does a lot of radio work. He was the announcer there for my childhood, and he made you laugh. He entertained you as much as the racing entertained you. So I
Yeah.
was addicted from a young age to the smell of exhaust. And, when you're a kid, you like the big crashes. When you're older
Mm-hmm.
and you understand how much time and money and energy goes into it, those big crashes break your heart a little bit. But they still
Mm-hmm.
get your blood pumping. But it's funny how I've changed as a viewer since then. As a kid, you look for your favorite driver and what they do. You look for the big crashes, and you might appreciate a good race here and there, but you're not thinking strategy. You're not worried about tire wear. You're just, or pitch strategy or any of those things. And frankly, at most short tracks, you're not worried about that anyways. But then now I'm like, I want to see those front 4 cars side by side for 10 laps, 15, 20 laps around a quarter-mile track, and fighting for every inch of asphalt and coming down neck and neck to the wire, and may the best man win. And that's one of the things that you don't see as much, those type of things at the top levels of racing, whether that be NASCAR, F1, whatever. You don't necessarily get a lot of those shoulder to shoulder battles, but the allure at those top levels, it is those things. It is the pitch strategies. It is the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
managing tire wear, all the different parts and pieces that go into it. So I think they can be appreciated together and independently. And so for me, it's all of those things, everything from the short tracks to the pitch strategy on the biggest stages. And I think it's more of a thinking man's game than people realize, So.
I was just about to comment on that, because when you're a kid, as you said, I just want to go fast. And
Yeah.
if something shoots off in a huge explosion, okay, cool. You're a kid, you don't know. The methodical nature of these sports. I don't know. I don't watch, like you said, much NASCAR, but in Formula One, there's called the second stint of the race. It's where you've already done one pit stop. You're maintaining your tires, waiting for your second pit stop, or just hoping you'll get to the end. And those guys can't refuel either. I don't know if refueling's allowed in NASCAR.
Yeah, it's definitely part
Yeah.
of the pit strategy.
Okay. So these guys, they don't. So it's all about the pit stop. When did you notice that this was a game of chess at 190 miles an hour? And then did that make you want to interview an engineer over a driver, or a mechanic over a driver, because they have the story as to, actually, this is why we failed today?
That is a really interesting question. And while I've done some of that, I usually looked for sort of New Hampshire tie-ins. So it wasn't so much like I'm really curious about the engineering factor. Interestingly, the only time I ever did it from that viewpoint was an NHRA engineer. But
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of my, I guess I'm a little narcissistic, a lot of my angles or my viewpoints are thinking of grabbing a casual fan or a not or someone who's not a fan and telling kind of the human story that would get them excited. So I'm pretty useless still with a lot of the technical stuff. I understand it when they talk about it. I get that it matters, but if you ask me to, I don't know, explain how tire wear impacted the Oxford 250, I would be like, I don't know. Some cars probably went slower than others.
That's
So,
that's a very around the outside response right there, brother.
it's just so I appreciate it, much like I appreciate people who do computer programming. That's really cool stuff that you do, and I have no idea how you do it. So I don't know that I've done that, but now that you said it, I kind of want to. You know what I mean? I talk about that technical side of things, and but most of my vantage point has been, what is a story that a fan would be interested in, or more, I like to hope that I draw fans in with my excitement. So I like to tell stories that somebody who might not have been a fan would say, oh, I'm curious about that. Check it out. And then maybe want to come to the track. So a lot of times that's kind of been more of my focus, is telling kind of the human stories.
Did you pick up on anything that you could have seen from the world of Formula One that you would want to talk about to try and connect to motorsport in general? For example, this last race, we had a late call. It was a timely late call for a 5-second time penalty, which kicked a dude who was in P4 all the way down, no points, no nothing. And he fought back from like halfway through the grid. So is that something that you think, okay, it happened in Formula One, but this actually interests me enough to delve into it?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, one of the things when I'm kind of new with a sport or anything like this, which I'm still pretty new with Formula One, if at first I didn't understand the 5-second penalties or whatever, the time penalties, because in like NASCAR, which is my general frame of reference, it would be, you have to do a drive through pit road at pit road speed is your penalty. So you're going to lose all those spots because you're having to go 60 miles an hour down pit road to get, or a stop and go in the pits. So that's kind of how they assess their penalties. And so at first I was like, how are they doing this? Where are they stopping them for 5 seconds? Like, I don't get what's happening here. And it took me about, I shouldn't admit this, I think it was probably my third time watching a race. And I was like, oh, they just like tack it on the clock. They don't even, I'm like, all right, now I get it. So like, you cross the line ahead of everybody, but they're like, oh, sorry, dude, you're 5 seconds behind where you thought you were. Oh, all right.
That's exactly it.
But I don't know. It's a thought-provoking question, because I think some of that cross-pollination, I think, is a good in sort of a rising tide lifts all ships scenario, because it allows people that are more familiar with other kinds to instantly say, oh, I'm used to that from X, Y, or Z. But I don't know. I can't think of a certain thing that necessarily. One thing that I have liked that I've watched with F1 is that they're pretty consistent, it seems, in how they address situations, whereas NASCAR has to work on that. They got to work on their consistency.
So Formula One's getting a rap for being consistently late with their calls that'll affect a race 3/4 of the way through, or even 6 hours after the race. You'll see somebody get a podium taken away. For example, in 2004, they were racing at Indianapolis. Juan Pablo Montoya, his car at the beginning of the race didn't start. 90 minutes into the race, he went to the pits, got his backup car. Okay, great. 90 minutes in, with 15 laps left, they black flagged him because they didn't submit one piece of paper. Yeah. And the guy was in the point P5, like up there too. He fought his way back. So gosh. It's a consistent issue, I think, that we have against all motorsport. Brother, what solution do you think you and I can brainstorm right now that they can get their act together?
Whew, I don't. It seems so simple when you don't have to make the decisions, you know? It's Like, boy, that doesn't make sense. I guess I wouldn't have done that.
Yeah. With the one camera view that I have and no one talking to me.
Yeah. I don't know. I think if we can figure that answer out, we might be able to make some money off of it, though. So we should put our brains on that. Because man, sometimes it seems like common sense is the last factor included in the process.
It really should just come down to that sometimes. I think we're getting into a realm in all of sport where there's such a reliance on technology, I think, to help us make calls. We could take a NASCAR approach, because one thing that I do appreciate about NASCAR, and you said it earlier, is when we're talking about the car, how they're discussing to the chief engineer when he means spotter. And this is what I think when I hear spotter. It's a dude with binoculars, right? Looking at the car.
Yeah, so someone usually up high somewhere that's keeping track, and they're in the driver's seat because they don't really have any peripheral vision, so they're basically their eyes, and they say,
Oh, wow.
hey,
Okay.
there's a guy inside you, left quarter, right door, left door, and or inside, outside door, and those guys kind of coach them, basically keep them safe from the other cars if they're doing their job well. If they screw up, it's usually pretty catastrophic, and there's a lot of torn up cars. So they definitely rely on them.
That's what I like about NASCAR, is that there's more of a reliance on the relationship between driver, engineer, and spotter. Whereas in Formula One, they rely on GPS. In Formula One, they have a sensor. Yeah. So instead of a spotter, they have a guy that's everybody. They red flagged a practice session last weekend because the GPS wasn't transmitting to race control. So that's how those guys, because they're all relegated to one area on the pit wall. That's why I asked you about the infield, because in NASCAR, if you guys haven't watched, it's a party on the infield. You just happen to have a track where cars go around, and then there's a party outside of it. And it's so much different. And I've been to a NASCAR race, and oh my God, I'm going to a Formula One race this June, but the NASCAR race, the people really weren't. Everybody there was just to have a good time, watch some cars go around, go super fast, and come back. But the people give a bad rap for low tech at NASCAR, but these guys in Formula One, sometimes it's if a sensor doesn't tell them. I personally don't believe their driver can say, well, it's this exact area. My question to you, sir, is how skilled are NASCAR drivers? I don't know if you've gotten to hear, or even when you're on your quarter mile track, how skilled are those drivers at deciphering what a computer can't?
Yeah, I mean, I at the short tracks, it's absolutely vital. I mean, most of those guys are working on their own cars, putting them together. They need to know it inside out and upside down, and not surprisingly, the folks who can work on the car the best tend to have the most success because they understand it. They know what it takes to make it do well. But I think that's kind of the same. I think as you go up through the ranks, that is probably a common theme, that guys who, as they came up, were working on their own stuff. And you hear it a lot of times. The refrain from a lot of people is, oh, all these, rich kids that never had to work on their own cars don't mind wrecking everything, which is, there's probably some truth to, but I think that the more reality of that is, it's not that they don't care if they wreck their cars, because nobody wants to wreck your car. No one wants to crash out of a race. It's that they're not as familiar with all the capabilities because they weren't necessarily the ones turning the wrenches or making the changes in a shop as they grew up. So they're not as familiar with the vehicle. Again, I'm not great on the tech side of things, but that's just kind of my guesstimate. And I think the guys that did do a lot of that as they came up through, guys like Brad Keselowski was a late model driver, and Joey Logano, I think, did some modifieds and stuff. And these guys who've had a lot of success at that level are guys who worked on their, drove their car, maybe theirs or their dad's cars, and worked on the cars when they were younger. And I think that gives them a better sense or a better feel for it.
That's pretty cool. You'll have the guys in Formula One, instead of saying she's pushing like a bitch, they'll come on the radio and say, check the car. All they'll say in like a one little text box is vibration front left, check the car.
Huh.
And that's where I find the difference in NASCAR comes in, because those guys don't have the sensors to tell them what to do.
Yeah.
They know exactly if it's pulling or pushing, what the camber needs to be, or what adjustment needs to happen on the fly coming in the pit lane. And thank you for bringing up the guys who you can tell the difference between those who have to work on their own vehicle and those who don't. And that's a huge issue of inequality in Formula One, because on one side of the pit, you have people, I don't know if you've heard the name Lance Stroll at all. Have you heard of him?
Yeah.
Yep. So he's on because his dad is a billionaire. And then on the same point in time, have you heard of Jenson Button before?
I've heard the name, but only because I've been watching a little bit of it here and there. So, and I think he raced the NASCAR race.
He's coming.
Yeah. I'm like, wait a minute, he just raced in NASCAR last week or 2 weeks ago now.
How'd he do? I didn't know he was racing. I'm bummed. I would have watched.
Yeah, he did all right. He and Kimi Räikkönen were in that race, and they both did all right at times. They both of them expressed some irritation with the way that the NASCAR boys like to kind of muscle each other around a little bit. They both were a little irked by that after the race. And Kimi had a nice run going and got spun out late. He was like up in the top 10 or top 5 and ended up getting spun out. But they're, driving these big, heavy cars around these tight corners, and especially at Circuit of the Americas, which is the turn 1 there is like a hairpin turn. It's a crazy way to start off. I always thought it was kind of interesting that that's turn 1 there. And guys just kind of bully each other a little bit because it's hard to pass on those road courses. And sometimes they'll get a little bit, use the fenders more than anything else. So those 2 guys were not super thrilled with that.
Were they the only 2 complaining about the driving techniques? I mean, I'm sure guys were saying some words, but
yeah. So there's been a lot of talk about kind of driving with more respect in NASCAR this year, because there's been a lot of driving without a lot of respect. Sorry.
Don't be sorry.
Laughing makes me cough. But it was really funny. And it's kind of the bummer of it is some media folks, they caught a little backlash, Button and Räikkönen, because they're like, oh, like these guys come in and they're upset with the way guys race, but that's just like how it's done here. Like, why are they complaining? And I'm like, well, that's not what they're used to. Like, it's okay to complain.
Yeah,
it's silly. It's silly to get upset with them for saying, hey, this was not what I thought it was going to be. Why do you bring them in, you bring in a different set of fans, potentially. You bring in different eyes to the sport. You should be celebrating that instead of worrying about their post-race comments, in my opinion.
I think that they should be celebrating it too. And welcome to NASCAR, Kimi and Jenson, because I didn't watch the race, but I can imagine the type of racing you're talking about. And Terrill, that would be a black and white flag instantly, or even just told, get out of the race. Because the last race, a guy just didn't even touch him. The guy went slightly to the left of the curb, but no gravel, no grass, no dust. And he was on the radio. Oh, he's pushing me wide. That's not fair. And then you bring up NASCAR racing. Well, no, this is rubbing, boys. This is rubbing.
That's funny.
Well, would it surprise you, to bring up the fact why I brought up Jenson Button, that when he would have to run a wet race in his karting days as a kid, he would go dumpster diving for the used slicks from yesterday? That's the type of difference that you have. And I think it makes a world champion when you have to work on your own car and you have to make something great that isn't. Because Lance Stroll, he's an amazing driver. I mean, they're all amazing drivers, don't get me wrong. But he's not a world champion. Jenson Button is. And I think by giving your kid that little bit of, you got to know your vehicle. And based off of just what I've heard from Kimi, from Jenson about this first race, how do you think they're going to do assimilating to, I don't want to say a lower level, but to a more ground base, more soul racing, because it feels like if you're in NASCAR, you're more in tune with the vehicle itself and not the sensors.
Yeah, I mean, if the results are, I didn't get to watch a lot of the race, so I didn't see a lot of Button's performance, but I'm connected with a lot of folks who were at the track and talking about it, and it sounded like Kimmy was doing, but I think he's raced at least once before with NASCAR, and I know he's got like 2 or 3 more races this year. It might just be the road courses that he's planning to be racing in. So he came in with a little bit more experience, but he was doing pretty well. And so not having seen a ton of that race, I don't have a good sense of that, but I think that from what you're telling me about him, I think that's probably why he ended up getting the opportunity. Frankly, he knows the vehicles, and is probably more adaptable than people who have only been doing, that F1, F2, the different kind of open wheel pieces. So I would venture a guess that as they get more accustomed to the vehicles, they're only going to get better. Because you don't make a good driver a bad driver by putting him in a different car. You just change the learning curve.
Yep. Oh, I like that. I've got a final question for you, and it's your thoughts and feelings. The 2008 World Championship has been brought in. Yeah, 2008 has been brought into question because that was talk of that a race that happened where a big point swing happened should have been illegitimized, but it never was. What do you think about governing bodies going back 15 years later and trying to take away a title from somebody?
I think that if it was a mistake and not blatant cheating, it shouldn't even be a consideration. If it's blatant cheating, maybe, but if it's a mistake somewhere, and unfortunately there's humans involved in every sport and humans make mistakes from time to time, and it's a bummer, but you can't, you don't waste people's time on that. Don't get people's hopes up if you're not going to make a change, and don't threaten to take something away from someone that was not there, something that they did wrong. That's kind of my thoughts on that one.
What if I told you the race that should have been illegitimized was because somebody cheated? A guy was told by his team to crash out to bring out a safety car to give his other teammate the lead. Do you think it's okay now? Yeah. Oh,
I think it's more okay.
Yeah.
I think
okay.
That's so let me ask you this though. So the first F1 race I watched all the way through, I told you this when we met, was the one where they made the call that ended up giving Verstappen the championship over Lewis. Yeah. That was my first entire F1 race I ever watched.
Wait, I forgot about that. Oh my God.
Like, what's going on here? I don't understand this. So given that, and that he still, granted, he was at a great disadvantage at that point but he still had a chance to race it out on the field. So in that case, if they still had a chance to race it out, I don't know. That's a tough one, man. That's when it's about cheating. To me, that opens it up a little bit more than if it was just like, oh, somebody screwed up,
Right.
So they had a similar. It wasn't for a championship exactly, but in NASCAR, gosh, I don't remember the year. But they had a guy. The team ordered one driver spin yourself out so that your teammate can pick up a couple spots to get it. So NASCAR has their playoffs, right? So he needed to pick up a couple spots to get into that chase spot, and so his teammate spun himself out, which I think gave him one position because he passed him, and then he passed a couple other cars, and then they caught it on the radio transmission, and we're like, "Hey, that's not cool."
They did it.
So, yeah, I don't remember if it was a code or what, but it was pretty obvious what was going on. So they said,
"Operation Spin Yourself Out."
Exactly. So that was what they ended up doing, I think. And to make it worse, it knocked Jeff Gordon, one of the biggest names in the sport, out of the play. So what they did, instead of, I'm afraid my memory's going to betray me on this, but I think that instead of kicking that guy out of the playoff format, they added Gordon in as an extra.
Okay.
And so it was quite the to-do. And then I think they both ended up getting knocked out in the first round of their playoffs anyway. So it ended up being really a non-issue, but a similar kind of situation, just not quite at that point in the season. So
when they were going through the process of trying to figure out what the hell they were going to do, was it just a shit show the entire time of wondering?
Indeed. Yeah. Because everybody, and of course, then you got like fans of either driver say, oh, well, like it's all part of the strategy. It's a strategy call, just like any other strategy call. No. That is not the integrity of the sport. That is not okay. Like
Schumacher did that. I forget what year he just planted his car, parked it on the racetrack in Monaco so nobody could get past him, and he got pole. That's
speaking of, so here's going back to our very first conversation about some of the different approaches of the drivers. In an Xfinity race a few weeks ago, they decided to black flag a guy who did not agree with the call. So Atlanta Motor Speedway, 1.5-mile track, big stage. He goes, he parks his car on the start-finish line on the track, gets out and walks back to the pits. Leaves his car out on the track in an Xfinity race. Joshua, and he's a guy who hasn't had a ton of success. He's a low-budget guy, but like he's one of those guys that everybody kind of roots for because he's worked his way through the ranks. He works on his own stuff. And had it been somebody, one of the people that not everybody likes that much, it would have been, oh, what a jerk, what a da-da-da. But it was this guy that everybody loves, and they're like, oh, he stuck it to them. Like, he showed them. Everybody agreed that it was a bad call by NASCAR, too, so that helped his cause. But I can't imagine seeing something like that at F1. We're like, all right, I don't like your call. I'm going to just park here in the middle of the track. Bye.
That's essentially what he just did. And this is why these moments that we've had over the past, 10, 15 minutes is why I'm excited that we've had a chance to talk, because we have been speaking about two different sports. And we talked, that's why I brought up the differences early on. So we had a set mark in the sand, and it's the same conversation.
Yeah.
The same thing is happening. It just happens to either be you get to see most of the wheel or you don't see most of the wheel. And I want to thank you very much for bringing this to our fan base, because I think that we just melded the line of, oh, I think we love motorsport because it's motorsport. And no matter what the engine is attached to, you're still going to have the same stories. You're still going to have the same blunders of calls, and you're going to have guys that just park in their car. Sebastian Vettel, he lost a race in Canada, and instead of him parking his car on the start-finish line, they line everybody up. He took the first place Packard and put it in front of his car. That's what I
saw that on. That's funny.
Yeah, that's what I think about when I think of that story you told me.
And so I know you got to get going. I have one question for you. All right, so a lot of the NASCAR guys, right? They go up to the stock to the fendered cars, but they go through the modified ranks, which are open wheel. So a lot of these guys go through these. It's obviously very different but it's open wheel cars. There's a decent number of guys right now that went through these modifieds to get to NASCAR, and then you look at like F1, a lot of these guys going through like IMSA and Trans Am and with full body cars and to try to make their way. So it's kind of a funny that they kind of have that invert. And I know it's certainly not 100% in either direction, but it's kind of funny to think that of the way that these guys traverse through the different levels and how they really have access to open wheel and full fender cars, whichever route they're taking.
Oh, I think in North America, too, you actually have more of an opportunity to race at an upper echelon league, because if you're in Europe, you're Formula One. I mean, GT, you've got touring races. I'm not saying that there isn't other big name races out there, but at least in America, you can say, you know what? I actually kind of want to drive some NASCAR instead of going over to Europe for Formula One. I think that's pretty cool that you brought that up. That's the availability of it all.
And so I got to get you at some point this summer to a modified race and see what you think of our short track open wheel cars. I'm going to be at New Hampshire Motor Speedway next weekend, a week from Saturday, and they're going to be racing up there.
Call me and I'll be there. Okay.
Sounds good.
Well, thank you so much for your time. If you don't have anything else you want to talk about, any questions for me, that'll be the closing of the show.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
Sir, we'll be talking to you later for sure. This was awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.
Bye now. That's all the time we have for you tonight. I want to give a big thank you to Terrill for coming on to the show. His perspective taught me that no matter what motorsport you're watching, NASCAR, NHRA, Formula One, there's still going to be something to talk about. Like the dude who left his car on the finish line and walked away from it. The closest thing we have to that in Formula One is Kimi Räikkönen going to his yacht. If you want to watch the full video, you can. Up on YouTube at ATO_USF1. That's the page, and then you'll see there's multiple videos. You're going to have a blast on there. You're welcome. If you want small clips, big clips, Formula One news, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, they're there for you at ATO_USF1. While you guys are on our socials, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. We love Formula One, and we love talking about Formula One to you. Muchas gracias, obrigado, dankeschön, and merci for every listen. Have a great week.